To cap off 2025, you wrote an article. It's published at America Out Loud. I'll make sure I link it in the article accompanying the show today. But you pose the question, is Canada now the poster child for politically driven climate data corruption? Tell us about this, because if it were just climate corruption, I would also believe that. But because I sat through the Green Slush Fund hearings where Liberal linked insiders were just voting themselves money for green schemes. But this is more about the corruption of the data itself. So the basis by which these people give themselves money to fight the climate scare, it's built on shifting sand, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it seems like if the data supports the climate narrative, then very few people check it because it helps them promote their cause, and that's exactly what happened here. It turns out that on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, we got a beautiful Christmas present from Dr. Joseph Hickey, Hickey, who's going to actually be on our America Out Loud show this weekend at 7 p.m. at americaoutloud.news if people want to hear our interview with him. He's a data scientist with a PhD in physics, okay? His specialty is complexity science, and there's not much that's more complex than climate change, that's for sure. Anyway, he wrote a report. It's got a complicated title, but it's not that hard once I explain it. The title is Artificial Stepwise Increases in Homogenized Surface Air Temperature Data Invalidate Published Climate Warming Claims for Canada. So he didn't pull his punches. He said point blank that it's actually a data artifact that is responsible for most of Canada's supposed warming. And what he found was that in 1998, at most stations across Canada, there was a stepwise increase, okay? Temperatures sort of going up gradually, which has been happening since the end of the last glacial. In fact, it's been happening since the end of the Little Ice Age, of course. And that's been a good thing, generally speaking, because I don't know about you, but I don't really want another Little Ice Age. But regardless, then suddenly in 1998, when they brought in 70 some odd new temperature sensors, the temperature suddenly jumped up 1 degree C. And from there on, it stayed at this 1 degree C greater. And so what he found is that that is a data artifact. In other words, it's not caused by nature changing at 1 degree suddenly in 1 year. It's caused by the fact that some of the data appears to be corrupted partly because of these new temperature sensors, but there can be other causes too. For example, if vegetation grows up around temperature sensing stations, and sometimes it can be a social thing too, because there's a different incentive for scientists to find a certain temperature. And I want to tell you a funny story that shows how data is actually affected by social things too. In the Soviet Union, the scientists who were in the far north were given a bonus when the temperature was below a certain level because it was miserable to live up there.
Yeah, okay? I believe that.
Yeah, and so you can imagine what they would do. They would push the temperatures down, of course, so they get their bonus. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was no longer possible for them to get these bonuses. So they started reporting the temperature honestly. So it appeared that the whole of the north of the Soviet Union, or then Russia, suddenly jumped up in temperature because there was no longer a financial incentive to say, oh man, it's cold outside. So there can be lots and lots of things that affect data. And it's interesting because over the years, there have been various reports and studies done which say that if you see a sudden stepwise change of as great as it, well, they're saying anything greater than about 0.6 degrees, but certainly if you see a sudden change in 1 year of a temperature that you're measuring, especially across a big area like Canada, if you see that change by a whole degree, then there's something wrong. Okay, there's something wrong with the data. Right. But Environment Canada, and actually what are they called? Climate Change and Environment Canada, they accepted that data. They apparently didn't examine it very closely. And suddenly the headlines are blaring, Canada is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. Well, as Dr. Hickey points out, if you take out that anomaly, that 1 degree sudden rise, almost all of the warming disappears. And I had a look at the temperature for Ottawa, for example, and it's something like 1.8 degrees. So suddenly it drops down to 0.8 degrees, over a period of about 7 decades in that neighborhood. And so it's interesting because he actually found this back in 2021 when he was a data scientist for the Bank of Canada. So it's wonderful that somebody within the government, in this case, the Bank of Canada, was actually checking the data. Okay. And he was. And he wrote to Environment Canada, and they sort of brushed it off. They said, oh, well, we had a quick look at the metadata. Metadata is the data before adjustment. And we're convinced this is real. This is a real temperature change, you know. But they said, it's probably a real temperature change. So here you have the scientist who was most responsible for, you know, putting together the data on which the government based billion-dollar policy decisions. And all she could say was, oh, it's probably real temperature change. So, you know, it's very fishy. And there's another instance here I'll give in a second where another scientist, another economist actually, at the Bank of Canada also found mistakes. But, you know, Sheila, this is very reminiscent of other studies which have later proven to be false. If the data and the methodology and the whole papers and everything that's published, if it supports the climate scare and it gives the government a bigger hammer to hit us with, to say, oh my God, Canada's warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world, then it doesn't seem like anybody really checks the data.